Okay, folks, we're going to get going in just a minute. You should have two pieces of paper. There's a copy of the PowerPoint that Mr. Stockmeyer is going to use, and a copy of the referendum article. They're right outside the door on a chair.
What? I get these. Oh, okay.
And it is 6:30, so we're going to get going. I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. Appreciate you being here. As you know, tonight we're going to be discussing the proposed formula change for the SAD 44 cost sharing fund that's going to town voters in November as part of the referendum. Those of you in the room, some of this is old news. For some of you, maybe this is the first time you've heard this. But NURI established a withdrawal committee several years ago, and over the course of the past few years, we've been working on that process. That has actually culminated with two previous cost-sharing committees being formed by the school board. The first one did, and this was a couple of years ago at this point, maybe 3 years ago, 2 to 3 years ago, and that one did not pass. The second one happened more recently, about a year ago, and that did not pass either, but it was a very, very close vote. And it's probably important to note that it passed overwhelmingly in NURI, but it did fail overall by just a handful of votes. And that was the second time. Earlier this year, the school board was approached, and a request was made to establish a third cost-sharing committee. The board thought about that and decided at the time that they were not in favor of forming a third cost-sharing committee because they felt it had gone to the voters twice before. Part of the process involved with creating a cost-sharing committee is that a petition can be gathered by folks in the towns and presented to the board, and if a sufficient number of people sign the petition, then the board is then required to institute the cost-sharing committee, and that did happen. A group of folks in the community went out and gathered enough signatures, presented it to the board, and the board then moved forward with creating a third cost-sharing committee. It's important to note that the third cost-sharing committee took a really hard look at the formula that had been proposed in the second vote, and they tweaked it a little bit. They extended the number of years that the process would take to 9. And folks, there's copies of the PowerPoint and the referendum ballot outside on a chair there. You might want to grab one. And then brought that back. And just a quick note, the cost-sharing committee basically has the power to develop that proposal. So they spent some time on it working with Mike Cormier, former superintendent in SAD 9, who was the consultant, and put together the referendum article that you see in that single page that you picked up on your way in. And that, again, was a result of a group that organized a petition and presented it to the board. So that third cost-sharing committee was then formed. The board then discussed whether or not it was going to be holding the referendum in June or in November. There were folks lobbying for both of those dates, and the board ultimately decided that they would hold the referendum, set the referendum date for November, with the hope that more people in the district would have the ability to weigh in on that. So that's now coming up on November 6th. So tonight, what we're hoping to do is to provide you with the information that you'll need to have in order to make an informed decision. I want to let you know that at this point, the selectmen in Newry, Greenwood, and Woodstock have all recently approved a resolution supporting the proposal, and Bethel is set to do so, I believe, later in October. The school board is also going to be considering this at its upcoming board meeting in October. So hopefully by the time that this referendum comes around, all of those parties will have had a chance to discuss it and voice their opinion on their support for it. It's important to note, this is really key, that if this new proposal does pass throughout the district, it requires a majority vote total throughout the district. It will not go into effect unless and until the town of Newry decides to or terminates the withdrawal proceedings. So the vote will be taken. If it passes, then Newry will have to terminate the withdrawal process in order for it to be implemented. If for some reason that didn't happen, then it would not go into effect. So again, tonight's focus is to review the PowerPoint that Attorney Stockmeyer has put together for us. Bill is our attorney. He's worked with us closely throughout this entire process. And then it will go to the voters with that referendum question that you see on November 6th. We've invited Bill here tonight. We felt that it would be helpful for him to explain the process and the steps that are outlined in that PowerPoint. I will let you know that the PowerPoint is going to be on our, I think it is already actually on our website and on our Facebook page. And I know there is some discussion about the possibility of different towns potentially doing mailings to its citizens to help make sure that they're informed about this. This has been going on for a long time, and again, really appreciative of the fact that you're here tonight to hear it. Despite the fact that this will be the third referendum, I'm sure there are still people who are not familiar with this, and the more people who can be informed about it, the better. So again, I want to thank you for coming out tonight. And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Bill Stockmeyer from Drummond and Woodsum. As I said, Bill is our attorney, and he's worked closely with us, and he's developed this PowerPoint that you'll be seeing tonight. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, David, and thanks everyone for coming out. And if anyone did come in the interim, the handouts are, I believe, just outside the door.
And I have some here. Does everybody not have one? Need one? What a good group. All right.
Pete, if you want to let it rip, we'll start. So I'm going to do this presentation. There are actually 18 slides here, and I thought it'd be helpful just to not assume too much. Some of you are very knowledgeable, others of you are very knowledgeable, but not in this particular area. I thought I'd start with just explaining, what is a cost-sharing formula anyway? How does your particular cost-sharing formula work? Why does that cost-sharing formula, which I think the district would generally say is fair, why nonetheless does it create an incentive and opportunity for Newry to withdraw, and what risk does that create for SAD 44? And how would the cost-sharing amendment address that situation? And what are the benefits and costs of the cost-sharing amendment? So the first thing, what is a cost-sharing formula? You can see here the total SAD 44 school budget has 3 revenue components. You receive some state subsidy, $671,000. You have miscellaneous revenues, which are tuition receipts from towns outside your district that send their students here. You might have carry-forwards, available cash from last year's budget, and that's the second revenue that makes up your total budget. And then you have the local tax portion of the budget. A cost-sharing formula is the method a school district uses to share that local tax portion of the budget. So we're not talking about the sharing between the state and the district. We're talking about how the towns share the district portion of the budget, okay? So in SAD 44, the local tax portion of the budget is $404,000 in the current year, okay? And that has 2 components, and you raise this money at your budget meeting each year and validated the budget validation referendum. First, you have to raise what are called the required local costs, and that's the money you're required to raise in order to receive all of your state funding, okay? Think of that as state matching dollars. So the first component of the local cost portion of the budget is this required local portion. The second component are the additional local costs that need to be raised to support the budget, but do not qualify for state support. For reasons we'll explain later, it's important to understand that somewhat uniquely, the SAD 44 formula divides both components of the local tax portion of the budget among the 4 towns. Now, that might seem like not even worth saying, of course it must do that, but as we'll explain later, that actually makes it stand out or be somewhat unusual, and we'll go into why that is, but it's important to understand that in order to understand the concerns that some people in Newry have and the problems that causes. So how does the formula work? So as I said, first of all, it works on both components of the local cost sharing portion of the budget. And then second, the division of costs of the total of the 2 components is based 100% on property valuation. The formula does not use pupil counts, okay? Now that's not all that unusual. Even in districts where there is a pupil count component of the formula, the large majority is generally based on valuation of the towns. So the formula works by dividing local taxes based 100% on property valuations of your 4 towns. So you have a formula that's based, that works on both of the 2 components of the local costs and is based on property valuation. So how does that look? Well, let's just take, you can see in this column the property valuations of each of your towns. Bethel is 34%, so they have 34% of the $8.4 million. Greenwood has 12% valuation, so they have 12%. Newry, 37%, and Woodstock, 16%. Now, set apart over here, I put the pupil count percentages. And you can notice a couple things. First of all, in Greenwood, the property valuation percentage happens to be currently almost exactly the same. These numbers are rounded, but almost exactly the same as the pupil count percentage. So as you can imagine, if you shift from one to the other, it's kind of cost neutral to Greenwood because their percentages are the same. So even if you had 100% pupil count in Greenwood, it wouldn't affect things very much. In stark contrast, in Newry, although Newry has 37% of the property valuation, they have only 5% of the pupil count. Okay? So, why is SAD 44's formula based on valuations? Why not pupil count, or why not a pupil count component? So the justification for using valuation is that the whole concept of public education is that education and the funding for education ought to be equitable. That means it ought to be divided equally throughout the taxing district, okay? And it ought to be adequate to support a meaningful education. In your district, with your formula, the taxes are the same throughout the district, okay? Doesn't matter if you have a pizza parlor in Newry, or in Greenwood, or in Bethel, or in Woodstock. You have a district system of education, not a town system. The schools are district schools, and wherever that pizza parlor is located, if it has the same property valuation, the taxes on that pizza parlor are exactly the same, okay? The same rate. And it might be argued that if you started to use pupil counts, that would result in an unequal tax rate, that is the mill rate, an unequal mill rate for education across the district. So critically, these are school district students, really, not town students. I sometimes hear people call them town students, but you don't have town schools, you have a school district schools, right? So just like you have county taxes for county things, you have a school district for education. So these are really school district students for purposes of education. The towns that get their shares actually simply serve as the tax collectors and the assessors to turn over the money to the school district. Otherwise, the school district would have to have a whole other set of tax collectors and assessors, which would be completely unnecessary. So they show up on your town taxes, but they're really school district taxes for school district education. All right, so if it's so fair, what are the objections to the cost sharing formula? Who could object to being fair, right? Well, remember I said Newry had 37% of the valuation and only 5% of the pupils. So the first objection that could be raised is that some in Newry feel overtaxed, even though the Newry school tax assessment is based upon exactly the same mill rate, because they only have 5% of the pupils. Okay? And while we may not be very sympathetic, we might be somewhat sympathetic to someone who has no children. I mean, think businesses don't have children, right? But the whole idea is they're taxed also because we all benefit from education. For some reason, people give this argument greater force when it's based on this town argument. But in any case, as a practical matter, the objection is that some in Newry feel that overtaxed because of their small numbers of students. The second objection is that some in Newry feel unfairly singled out compared to other school districts, towns and other school districts in the state, and this is why. So I remember I said that critically the cost sharing formula in SAD 44 works on both components of the local costs. The required local share that qualifies you for state funding and the additional local costs. And that was true everywhere in the state. Okay? Because why would there be two different ways of doing that? It's just local taxes. That was true everywhere in the state until 2005. In 2005, the legislature changed this system, hoping to encourage high valuation towns that did not belong to school districts, hoping to lower the barriers to them joining school districts. So what they did was, in 2005, the legislature enacted a new statute that overrides local cost sharing formulas as applied to the required local costs, the EPS component. Okay, so it doesn't matter that you have a cost sharing formula based on valuation in most of the state. The statute redistributes those based upon pupil count. And then the cost sharing formula only applies to the additional local funds. So the whole system in 2005, you were the same as everybody else until then, that got changed. Okay, so when they did that in 2005, however, the legislature realized that this would create a huge problem in two school districts, SAD 44 and SAD 6, okay? As applied to SAD 44, had they allowed this change in the law to apply, $2 million plus in taxes would have shifted from Newry to the other towns. And the legislature realized that that was a drastic impact. And so the whole point of the legislature was to create an incentive for people to join, but they didn't want to create impacts that harsh, okay? The other school district happens to have been SAD 6, which is Buxton and Standish and some other towns. Fry Island in SAD 6 had withdrawn from Standish on condition that they remain part of the school district for purposes of paying taxes, and they have no students on the island in Sebago Lake. So obviously, they would have no school taxes at all, and that seemed unfair, and they made a special deal to secede from Standish, and part of that deal was that. So there were these two unique school districts in the state where the legislature realized that if this change was implemented, it would have these drastic impacts. And so, notwithstanding that, ever since then, some in Newry have pointed out, you're treating us differently from other school districts in the state. That's unfair. So the third objection is really not an objection of Newry. The legislature recently, within around, I want to say 2012 or so, reenacted a law that allows towns to withdraw from school districts by means of a withdrawal agreement, and then turn around and pay less as non-members than they did as members, okay? So if you can get an agreement, let's say you're a very small town, You don't have that much economic impact, okay? And so, but it's possible to achieve a withdrawal agreement where you withdraw and then you tuition your students back and pay less as a non-member than as a member. So the formula puts SAD 44 at risk because NURI now has a statutory pathway to withdraw and a financial incentive to withdraw. Okay, and if that happens, the withdrawal agreements that have been negotiated would provide for NURI to tuition their students back, and if they were able to do that, and if the district conceded that, they would presumably be tuitioning their students back at a much lower rate. So where's this left SAD 44? So NURI, as David mentioned, has started the withdrawal process. There's been kind of a timeout while we go through this cost-sharing formula idea, but they seek to withdraw, the withdrawal committee, and they seek to allow the NURI students to still attend school in SAD 44 and save money. If that were to happen, NURI's withdrawal would ultimately impact education and taxes in your school district and the other towns, resulting in a greater than $2 million tax shift to those towns. Okay? No withdrawal agreement has been reached. Okay? It would be very difficult for public officials elected by Bethel or Greenwood or Woodstock voters to say, okay, we'll agree to a $2 million tax shift to our towns on an agreement that their voters legally don't even get to vote on. Okay? So, I mean, I think you can understand the reluctance to reach such an agreement. As a result of that, there's been a lot of pressure from NURI to the Department of Education and to legislators in Augusta to amend the withdrawal statute. Okay? The withdrawal agreement has not been reached. It's at essentially an impasse. Neither side can give in. NURI doesn't want to give in because they feel they have this opportunity. The district doesn't want to give in because of the $2 billion tax shift and the other consequences. So NURI would like to amend the withdrawal agreement. That amendment, if it were enacted, and the amendment was enthusiastically supported by the Maine Department of Education, I believe it passed with unanimously in the Education Committee. David, is that correct? Was it unanimous? And went to the floor. Usually at that point in time, a matter of, a matter like that you'd expect to pass in the legislature, but the bill was withdrawn by Democratic leadership. Okay, so the bill came within a whisker, really, of being enacted, and that bill would have allowed, in the event of an impasse, for a private third party to be hired to try to negotiate a deal, and if he or she could not negotiate a deal, to simply impose the withdrawal terms on the school district. Say, this is it. It doesn't matter that you've agreed to this agreement. This is the withdrawal agreement, even without your agreement. Okay, so that came within a whisker of passing. And I'll tell you that no matter how many people in Augusta who tried to explain this to, the district was not well received. So, if NURI were to withdraw, let's just summarize the impacts. If that law were to be reintroduced and passed next time, because changes in the legislature or, whatever, changes in the circumstances or changes in the arguments, let's say it was reintroduced by the Department of Education again, was passed by the Education Committee again, and this time, instead of being pulled by leadership, it passed the legislature. So what would happen? 3 impacts. There would likely be a $2 million plus tax shift to Bethel and Woodstock. Why to just those 2 towns? Remember I said Greenwood had the same percentage of pupil count as valuation, so economically they would be kind of neutral. Yes, sir?
If it's okay to ask a question, if NURI did withdraw, and this may be something for David to answer as well, and there was a $2 million tax shift, would the reimbursement from the state go up? we would be losing, what, 3 point something
No,
million
you
and
wouldn't.
5 students. So the reimbursement, Dave, is not based on financial?
No.
It is, but it wouldn't change the reimbursement of the state.
We would not have hit the ceiling yet. That would be required, we'd be required to hit before the state would kick in additional money.
Even losing 3 point something million in Newry and 5 students?
They'd be looking at the 2 million piece. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
we looked at that.
Okay.
Yeah, we have to run pro formas, and that would be the consequence.
True.
Whoops. There we go. So if that were to happen, okay, I'm not sure every taxpayer would say, okay, that's fine, my taxes are going up, that's okay. We believe that's going to put severe pressure on the education that the district is able to provide, okay? Because you have inflation anyway, and now you've got this tax shift on top of inflation, okay? And even if that were phased in, year after year after year, those increases would be very difficult to sustain, we believe, okay? And that could threaten the viability of SAD 44 as a school district. And so that is the risk, if you will, okay? So far, everything's good. The bill got pulled at the last hour by the legislature, but forever is a long time, and sooner or later, the risk is that that would happen. So how would the cost-sharing amendment work? All right, now we're actually to the subject of the referendum, but I think that background is important. Under the current cost-sharing formula, you have a formula that's 100% valuation based. Under the amendment, it would be based 85% on valuation and 15% on pupil counts. Okay? So if you had $1 million in costs, 850,000 of those costs would be divided by the towns based upon their respective valuations, and 15% of those costs would be divided based upon their respective pupil counts. The current formula applies to both local tax components, the required local component and the additional local component. That would remain the same. Okay? The amendment would be phased in over 9 years, so that wouldn't happen all at once. It would happen over 9 years. And as David mentioned, even assuming it's passed with this referendum, everything will stay the same unless and until Newry has a separate opportunity to decide whether to terminate its withdrawal effort. And if it terminated its withdrawal effort, the first year the phase-in would begin, the year after they decided to do that. It was very important to Newry to not be forced or anything, and I don't believe this referendum could have done that anyway. So it sort of puts it in Newry's hands, okay? So, let's just look at this slowly. This is the most complicated slide, but it's not too, whoops. What happened here? Just look. Oh, okay, someone did that. Very nice. I'm going to put it all up because I think it's actually easier to see, okay? Because I have my death ready. So, with my death ready, let's just look at the year of the phase-in. So, the current formula is 100% valuation, 0% pupil count. If this amendment passed, okay, and if Newry terminated its withdrawal effort, then the phase-in would begin. In years 1 and 2, it would go to 95% valuation, 5% pupil count. In years 3, 4, and 5, it would be 90%, 10%. In years 6, 7, and 8, it would be 88%, 12%. And in year 9, it would be fully implemented with a 15% pupil count, and then it would stay the same going forward. So, in Bethel, assuming no other changes, obviously there are going to be lots of changes over the next 9 years. There's inflation, there's changes in state subsidy, there's all sorts of changes. But just to look at the effect of the cost-sharing amendment, you assume everything else stays the same. So what would happen? In Bethel, you would go from $2.874 million in local taxes. In years 1 and 2, with the 5% pupil count, it would go up somewhat, and it would keep going up very slightly, less than 1% a year, to there, and then that would be fully implemented. In Greenwood, remember, the valuation percentage and the pupil count percentage in Greenwood was approximately 12%. There's slight differences. So in Greenwood, things stay pretty much the same. Okay? In Newry, you see a tax reduction implemented over the 9 years. And it was similar to Bethel, slight increases each year for the 9 years. So what's the financial impact, to summarize what you just saw? In Bethel and in Woodstock, the tax impact would be virtually 1% per year for the first 9 years, and then the cost sharing amendment would be fully implemented, no further impact from the amendment. In Greenwood, virtually no change, for the reasons again stated. And in Newry, there would be a 13% tax reduction after 9 years, implemented over those 9 years, bottom line, and every year thereafter. I think the best way to look at this, be right with you, is to view this as a political compromise, okay? To resolve the current withdrawal impasse, and it's important to note, it's not a legal bar to future withdrawals. That's not something that can be done to this, but it's important to note that. But it will not begin unless and until Newry decides it wishes to terminate the current withdrawal proceedings. Yes, sir.
So would if there was drastic change in school populations within the town, so if Bethel were to drop 10% of their population of students, that formula would adjust accordingly?
That's another example, a very good example of how things actually will happen, change over time. Your pupil count percentage relative to the other towns, your pupils might increase. It might increase by exactly the same percentage as every other town for 9 years. That's highly unlikely, okay? If yours increases, and other towns might increase, but not at the same rate. If yours decreases, it might decrease as in other towns, but not at the same rate. So those percentages will change. Likewise, the property valuation percentages are not going to remain constant over that 9-year period. But the only way to measure what this is doing is to pretend for a moment that everything does remain constant so you can isolate it. But that's a very good example. So, let's look at the cost sharing amendment versus the withdrawal impact. The cost sharing amendment impacts would be, we believe it would lower the risk of legislative intervention. What we kept hearing in Augusta was we would get pulled aside. I would get pulled aside. David would get pulled aside. Marcel, I think you were up there. The people who are up there would get pulled aside. We want you to resolve this locally. I don't want to see this back in front of my education committee, the education committee, the committee that I'm on, okay? So we believe that if we get buy-in from everybody, that lowers the risk of legislative intervention. The current withdrawal effort would have to stop, although not a legal bar to future withdrawals. The district then remains intact. Newry still belongs to the district. A $400,000 cost shift as opposed to a $2 million plus cost shift. 9-year phase-in, and the district remains viable. Without this amendment, you're going to have a higher risk of legislative intervention. The current withdrawal effort continues, and I can just tell you that saps everybody's strength and time and ability to concentrate on educating students. Newry would withdraw instead of remaining a member. you would have a $2 million plus cost shift instead of a $400,000 cost shift. The phase-in would probably be the same or similar. That's certainly been contained in Newry's withdrawal proposals thus far, so probably it would be phased in, the $2 million. The problem with this is, after 8 or 9 years, even if you phase it in, $2 million is $2 million. And that's $2 million every single year looking into eternity, right? Unless other things change. And the impacts of that, it's believed, would threaten the continued viability of the school district. So that's just sort of a comparison of one versus the other. And so some people see things a little better visually. So this just shows the shift in taxes. Let's start at Greenwood, no change, right? Woodstock, less than 1% a year. Similarly, Bethel and Blue, less than 1% a year change, and Newry going down, okay, from 37% of the local taxes to 32%, which is about a 13% drop. In other words, to be clear, that 5% drop, 5% is 5 over 37 is, I believe, about 13%. So when we say a 13% drop, I'm talking about actual dollars. Same thing another way. This is the last slide. Currently, everybody has the same tax rate. Okay? These are tiny rounding errors. These are virtually microscopic differences due to rounding. And so you start out with the same tax rate, which arguably is the fairest way to do things. And you end up with somewhat different tax rates by year 9, okay? Still relatively similar tax rates, but definitely with some, think of it as, again, a political compromise or an accommodation. So that's all I have for this, but if there are any other questions, I'd be glad to answer them, or maybe if you have questions for David, I'm sure he'd be glad to answer them also. And also, I think David wanted me to say, this is a public hearing, so I think people want to hear from the public. If you would like to just comment or share your view, you're also, you know, since I'm up here, I'll call on you and feel free to share.
Go ahead.
In front of you? Yes, sir.
Yes, Dennis Ryan, Greenwood. A few things, if I might. One, I'm going to request there's different select board members from different towns here. I know I've approached him. I'm going to request that all the district towns put together a brief synopsis of this information and do a direct mailing to the resident taxpayers so that nobody can say, I didn't know anything about it. I mean, you're talking $300 to $500 per town versus $2 million. That's a pretty easy decision. So I'm requesting that of each select board in each town. Number 2, why anybody in Greenwood would not vote for this is beyond me. But it's basically because I believe they didn't really understand the implications of this. But $2 million is a ton of money. And to the educational part, my last point, David, when we presented the petition to you back in the spring, I believe you made a comment, or you asked the school board, how are you going to educate our students with $2 million less money? And there was no answer. And I understand that, why the school board can't answer that. Because as a business person, if you take 25%, which is roughly what $2 million would be. If you take 25% of your business, you're not in business anymore. It's not possible to make it up. The school district is in the business of educating students, the taxpayers and the revenue. So it all does interconnect. So this is really a no-brainer. This compromise should be an extremely simple vote. And if we're looking at education, every year, the budget has stayed the same. I was shocked to see that the state share is like $671,000 out of $11 million. So if anybody from the state says they're here to help educate your children, that's BS. Because they're not doing it. So we need to have the education of the children. Because without education, families are not going to either stay or not going to move to this area. And then what happens to our area? It becomes extremely stagnant. So please get the word out. This is an easy vote. It should pass overwhelmingly. Thank you.
Bill, if I could just to build on Dennis's point, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, our school district about 13 or 14 years ago was receiving about $2.7 million in state aid. And that gradually dropped down to somewhere around $300,000 at its low point. And so one of the concerns that Dennis mentioned, our budget really hasn't changed. It's averaged, I think, about 0.5% per year increase over those 13 years. But to the taxpayers, it has felt huge because you've been absorbing about $2.4 million that the state used to provide. And that's based on, from the state's point of view, property valuations going up higher than what they typically go up as an average across the state. So, but no question, if we were to lose $2 million, we would see some significant changes to the district if the district was able to continue.
So if you look at slide 3 on your handout, you can see that the state subsidy portion is only $671,000 this year. That's a small number for a budget of this size, reflective of what David is saying. So he's saying that in past years, that might have been a much bigger number, which then reduces the local taxes needed to make up the budget. But because that revenue has been going down, for the total even to stay roughly the same, the taxes have had to increase. Any other questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Could you tell us how the state subsidy is figured?
Sure.
If you say no.
I actually can.
What about 3 people in the state who can tell you?
So the state has a funding formula called Essential Programs and Services, or EPS. As you know, the state aspires to pay 55% of the total cost of education. That's 55% of the statewide total cost of education. Even if the state were to achieve that 55% goal, that would mean that every district got 55%. Property wealthy districts would get less, and property poor districts would get more to sustain their education. But they haven't been able to achieve even the 55%. So the funding formula also doesn't fund all of the costs of education. When it says the total cost of education, that's, you might call it a term of art, you might call it a misnomer. Because the state's view, taking the state's view generously, is that we don't fund 55%, if we could fund 55%, but whatever it is we don't fund everything. That would be a blank check to all of these school districts to increase their costs, and our costs would go up. So our model models what we think the essential costs are, and those costs that the state deems to be essential by virtue of its model are what it aims, what it strives to fund 55% of, which it hasn't been able to achieve. Now, it's probably also important to note that the state has tweaked and adjusted and changed the model. So the virtue of this model is, if a cost is essential, the idea is that it's funding the cost necessary to achieve a high-quality education. Theoretically, that was the inception of this model. What's happened is the state can't afford its share, so one way the state tries to afford its share is to tweak the model to further reduce what it has to fund. So over time, what was envisioned as an outcome-determinative model, a model that would achieve an educational outcome, has become a model that is trying to contain costs. Classic example is that the state used to pay 100% of the teacher retirement costs. The state folded those costs into the model, thereby increasing the percentage of what it paid without paying a single extra dollar. okay? Because you're paying, let's say, 45% of this big cost and 100% of this cost. If you put them together, you're now paying, turns out it was like a 2% swing, 47%, without paying any more dollars. And then there are constantly changes. So, the way the model works is that the state determines for each district what the costs are that the model will fund. Then the state decides to measure whether the district can afford its share of those costs. And it does that on a town-by-town basis. So the first thing the state says is, well, how much of these costs of the district do we attribute to each town? And then let's decide if the town can afford that attributed share. And it says, okay, well, Frontier Justice, if Newry has 5% of the students, then 5% of the cost must be due to Newry. If Bethel has 37% of the students, then 37% of the cost of the district must be attributable to Bethel. Now that's not exactly true, as you can imagine. Teachers in one town might cost less or more than teachers in other towns, but you get the idea. If you're going to measure what each town can afford, I mean, the other way to do it is to measure just what can the district afford based upon its property valuation. But instead, they divide it up town by town. And then they say, okay, can Bethel afford its share? Well, how do you decide that? So the state has a statewide uniform mill rate, which if you think of a mill rate is a level of tax effort. And one mill is $1 tax for every $1,000 of valuation, or $100 of tax for every $100,000 of valuation. So a mill rate is just a measure of tax effort. And the legislature says to itself, well, the maximum local effort that we're going to impose on the towns to measure whether they can afford their share is something like 8.4 something mils. And then if each town, we'll look at what each town's property valuation multiplied by the mill rate, and if that does not raise enough for that town's share based on its pupil count, okay, so low valuations in the town, high pupil counts, then the district will kick in subsidy, then the state, excuse me, will kick in subsidy to the district. Okay, it's district subsidy, but its need is measured on a town-by-town basis. Okay, so that is the same, and then the district says, okay, if the town or towns can afford their share, we'll throw them a bone. We will call them a minimum receiver, and there's an even more complex formula for throwing in a small amount for towns that can afford their share, so they don't just revolt completely for getting zero. So that's essentially how the state funding formula works, and I'd be glad you asked.
Yes.
Steve, do you understand that?
Yes, ma'am.
So we're in, say this passes, we're in year 3, and Newry decides to try to withdraw again.
Yeah, they could do that. So there's no way to stop that, okay? So the best way to think of that, and you either buy this or you don't, okay? Your position might be, if I don't have a guarantee that they won't ever withdraw, I'm not agreeing to this, okay? And my view of that is you're like a car headed towards a tree, and the only question is how close is the tree? Because based on the reception that I think we received in Augusta, I think there's a pretty high likelihood of this amendment happening, the terms of the withdrawal being forced on the district at that point, and that's like hitting the tree, okay? So if you think of the cost share amendment as a, if you will, a handbrake, you know, you're going to stop the car. It either will or it won't work, okay? At the end of the day, if it doesn't work, you're right where you were if you believe the analogy of hitting the tree. So have you really lost anything?
So do you freeze?
If you don't believe you're ever going to hit the tree, if you don't think Augusta would ever do that, then...
So follow-up question, in year 3, they decide to withdraw again, do we freeze at that point?
No, this would continue, and you presumably would not have a withdrawal agreement. I think it would be even harder for Newry to achieve a withdrawal agreement after this effort. And I think Augusta would be less receptive based on what we heard before, and the Department of Education would be less receptive. There aren't, again, it's a political compromise. It's not a legal bar.
It's sort of like having, you know, you're having trouble with your spouse, so you say, I'll agree to go to counseling if you agree never to leave, right? You're kind of going on good faith, right? I mean,
You're going to make an effort.
Woodstock could do it, Greenwood could do it, Bethel could do it, Newry could do it. I think Newry is saying a lot as a town by being here and listening to our offer and saying they overwhelmingly accepted it last time. So I think they're showing a lot of good faith, and I think they're paying a lot of money. If this meeting was here to see if we wanted Newry to join us and bring their 5 students and $3 million, I think every hand in the room would go up pretty fast. So I think if we turn the tables and say, all right, we're trying to let Newry into the district, what do they offer? 5 students, $3 million. Where do we sign them up? Right? So I think we have to look at it, that we have a nice neighbor, they're here to compromise, and I'm willing to take them on their face.
Yes, sir.
Jim Lars.
Hi, Jim.
How you doing?
Good.
So thanks for putting this all together.
I hope it's helpful.
Very helpful.
This is really, really complicated stuff, and it's like, I'm fully aware that most of you don't spend your days immersed in this. You've got like life to live, you know? And so the challenge was to try to put something together that people could actually understand, you know? So hopefully did that, but go ahead, I'm sorry.
So you did, for me anyways, you did it very well. You talked about, you saw this as a political compromise. What a statement, especially right now. I mean, the world isn't doing it any good. And I think that's right, you know, Ron pointed out, it would be a political compromise. The point I want to make sure that everybody knows is, what I hear from most folks in Newry, and I personally feel myself, don't single us out. When there was legislation presented in Augusta that said Newry can't withdraw, are you kidding me? That put me over the edge. That put me over the edge. That's just, we have been singled out. Nobody else in the state has a formula that has no people count included, correct? I don't know.
Well, no one else there are lots that have no pupil count, but no one else in the state has a formula, well,
100%.
I don't say no, because there might be one or two, that goes back in and reallocates the required local contribution. Actually, I have a list of about 10 that don't follow the state model exactly, and there are a few, I think, that do that. But the problem is that the impact in Newry is so big because of the disparity between its valuation and its pupil count. I think of the wealthy neighborhood in Portland where I'm from, you know, so, you know, they don't have many students. Well, the reason they don't have many students is the property valuations are so high. In Newry, it's a little bit different. So, should we or shouldn't we feel bad about that? And Jim and I disagree slightly, I think, on that point. But it doesn't really matter because we're talking about the real world and we're talking about politics. And I certainly understand the position in Newry. So this is trying to offer something.
This is to offer something that we're at least treated more like everybody else in the state than we currently are.
Yeah.
The final point I want to make, Newry's got to pay $2.7 million 9 years from now. Everything else stays the same. I mean, yeah, who knows what will happen, but Newry's still got to pay $2.7 million. It's not like the town of Newry say, no, we don't want to pay. You know, where 2.7 is a big piece, and to Ron's point, you know, you lose that 2.7 and we tuition our students back in, how much money you gain. So
The mill rate is still quite considerable compared to the pupil count at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. But I just want to make sure everybody hears it. We're not paying enough. We're still paying a large, you know, it would be the second largest at that point. If we get more students, our rate will go up. You know, at the end of the day, this could all flip. Who knows what happens 25 years ago, who knew what the town of Newry would look like? 25 years from now, who knows what the town of Newry would look like? This could all flip. We could be paying more because of this formula than we currently have. So, again, thank you for putting this all together. I think it's really well done. I hope people get the message that this is a political compromise, and that would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I just say also, I think it's really an effort of David and the school board to try to get the information to people, as best they can, so.
Yeah, and I sincerely appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, as much as it's been contentious, it's always been a conversation.
Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Rogers, and I'm from Newry, and I'm a school board director, and I am also on the withdrawal committee. Gary and I are here. I don't think there's anyone else here on the withdrawal committee. I am speaking for myself. I have not for withdrawal, and I never have been. I was on the committee because I was mandated as because I was on the school board. So I thank everyone for working this all out, and I will certainly, again, it has to go to the voters of Newry. But I feel as a committee, and I'm speaking from myself on the committee, that we would say, let's just stop. Stop the withdrawal. This compromise is wonderful. It gives them something to go on, and we need to go forward, and we need to educate our kids, and that's what it's about.
Thanks, Eddie. Yes, ma'am.
I'm pretty much new to this, and Marcel's filled me in over time. Just by observation about this is a very wonderfully kind of a united effort between the different towns that looking at the different assets of different towns and how we think about our children and share some of this responsibility about putting too much of a burden where there isn't enough financial resource. I think it's an excellent portrayal of how we can work together, and I appreciate Newry for considering this, given their configuration.
Thank you. Yes, Marcel.
Marcel Pollock from Woodstock, and I do serve on the school board, and I'm talking to myself. I want to acknowledge this is a political compromise. And one of the take-homes that I hope people learn is this, what I consider a shame of what the state has played the games with this EPS formula. It did as good a job as I've ever heard, but I still do not understand how they've differentiated what are essential programs and services. And the fact that there's about $6 million that they acknowledge are essential programs and services, and about $2.5 million that they don't. That goes on our backs. So this is something, aside from the withdrawal issue, that I think it's really important for every voter to understand and take and question our legislators as to what they're doing to make sure that Augusta does pay what it says it's going to do. And because public education is expensive, as Dennis has clearly and very well stated, it's critical to the health of our communities. And there are a lot of people in these communities who are on fixed incomes. They can't afford the taxes sometimes. And I just feel that Augusta has really avoided paying its fair share of this EPS formula. And I still don't understand how they differentiate it. And that's as much of a problem as anything else. Thank you.
Yeah, I won't go into that point because that would be a really long talk.
David, if I could point one more very important thing out. If there was a $2 million, let's say worst case scenario, we already pulled out, and there was a $2 million tax shift. I'm a builder and a real estate broker, and I can assure you, my clients ask about what the taxes are in a particular town when they look at land or look at a house to buy. That $2 million tax shift will compound with the fact that if people can buy land in Newry with a lower tax base and build their house close to the skiway, they will. Bethel will receive less, Woodstock and Greenwood will receive less new construction because the taxes will be so out of skew between all the towns. And Newry will get new construction, which will help keep their taxes down. We are currently putting, I think, around $6 million worth of new taxable property on the books in Bethel. I don't know what Kip's putting on the books. But when you look at that, the new taxes are holding down the existing taxes. I mean, that's a source of revenue, right? So it's gonna, my mind is that $2 million is gonna look like $3 million in a few years and then keep compounding up, because the higher our taxes, the more people are going to want to build in Newry or maybe in Greenwood, because Greenwood is stable. But as a landowner in Bethel, and I actually own property in Newry as well, it's rather alarming to think that the new construction in Bethel would slow down, and that's a source of new revenue for the town, so the taxes would even go up higher. And that's something that doesn't get thought about a lot, but I think it would definitely happen.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for putting together a presentation. Very, very well done. Echo Jim's statements on it. I had a bunch of reflections after going through this process for a couple of years, but I will put that to the side and ask every one of you and ask everyone in the district to really think about this decision that they have before them. But just a couple of points that were made. A political compromise has already been made about 25 years ago when the value of Sunday River started to increase. And the compromise is, until it changes, is that property values in Newry afford the municipal mill rate for Newry to be very, very low, very low. And those services are picked up from the surrounding towns, namely Bethel. And that they would pay their share through the uniform tax rate for the school, even though they have little kids. And that was based on that the value of Sunday Rivers is not God-given. It is made up of the workers, Jim, and Dennis, everybody pretty much worked at Sunday River if you from this area. And that hard work has put the value and continues to put the value in there. And those employees, they don't just come from Newry. They come from Bethel and Woodstock and Greenwood. And that was the balance, and that was the political compromise. The second thing to point out is I know Newry doesn't want to feel like they're being singled out, and they felt that they've been singled out with the legislation. But as you said, that the legislature has pushed back, and what they pushed back was wording and change in the legislation that would afford an easier time for Newry to withdraw. So that in effect is asking to be special on that. So I just offer those as another side to everything. I kind of see this as an insurance policy. I mean, you can pay a high premium, which, this does come as a cost to Bethel, Greenwood, and Woodstock. You can pay a higher premium, which this would be, to bet against yourself that you don't have a horrific accident later on, or that Newry would pull out later on. Or you can really reflect and try to keep the status quo for them. Just some thoughts to reflect on. Thanks.
Thank you.
If I could kind of point that for a moment. Jim, did you folks have to borrow money this year for roads? Did you put a bond for roads in Newry? Did you guys borrow money to fix up your roads? Right?
We have a bond.
You have a bond?
Yeah.
But that wasn't this year, that was last year.
Last year, sorry.
But we're still paying.
Right. So I manage around 200 condos, so I'll speak for the non-resident taxpayer for a moment, which they're an important part of Newry. I manage about 200 condos on the mountain and probably 100 houses in the valley. And what I hear all the time is, boy, we all pay these taxes, none of us have kids in the schools. How come our roads aren't better? Why do we borrow money for our roads? So I kind of see the the tax-paying non-resident side, and this is surely a compromise for them as well. It's going to leave Newry. My understanding is Newry's not trying to lower their overall taxes. They just want to use the money to fix up their infrastructure. I'm not sure if that's actually the plan, but that's what I've heard. And so what is it? 85% plus are non-residents, taxpayers, is that close? So 85% of the taxpayers in Newry aren't residents, they don't have a vote. But they're not complaining. I mean, we haven't seen a ton of letters in the newspaper or even people complaining about the fact that 85% of them are paying taxes and they're not residents. So, as a taxpayer of the other towns, I've got property in Greenwood, Bethel, Newry. I can afford a 1% increase per year, 9% over 9 years, but I surely can't afford 40, 50% tax increase with Newry walks away. I don't want to play Russian roulette with the kids. I don't want to play Russian roulette with the taxes or the schools. This is a very, very fair deal, and I thank Newry for it.
Okay, unless there's another question.
I got up prematurely, sorry about that. I want to thank Bill too. Bill has done a great job of helping to put this, or actually putting this together. And I think it really does do a good job of explaining everything that, you know, we've been trying to explain for the previous 2 rounds. So tonight, I would hope that you will all take the information that you've heard tonight, try to at least inform your neighbors. As I mentioned before, we'll have copies of this on our website and on our Facebook page. Encourage people to look at it so they get a better sense of what it means. And if anybody has any questions, they can feel free to call me at the office. And you know, on November 6th, we will find out what's going to happen. So, yes.
Barry Hallett,
Hi, Barry.
Woodstock. Hi. I mean, this little group here represents the size of a classroom, and I'm glad I'm here. I'm glad I got to hear all this because it's opened my eyes to it. How do we get them? And I understand we tell the people we know, but how do we really get the message to people?
And
so
I think Dennis's point is a good one about trying to get at least
Go
some
to
of
the
the
next
basic
select board,
information out.
next Woodstock select board meeting and specifically request that this information gets sent out.
Okay.
That's the best way. Then it gets sent to every residential taxpayer. They can't say, oh, I didn't know about it.
Okay.
Because the taxes, I believe, in Woodstock alone, if Newry withdraw, is a 50% tax.
But so whatever they're informed about, is it going to be clear that they understand that this really makes sense?
Well, hopefully, you know, I mean, that's up to how, I would think that the town managers could get together and come up with basically one template that then you plug in the different numbers for the different towns and send it out. So everybody's getting the same.
So it's almost an over-and-done.
Yeah, I think it's a very easy thing to accomplish.
I also want to just say too that throughout this whole process, it's been very helpful. I feel like we've had a great working relationship with all of the town managers. We've been coming together and discussing this throughout the entire process. So I think they'd be in a good position to be able to do that. Vern?
Just one thought. Technology is wonderful. Amy and Kim and I have already discussed having lunch to plan a format to send out, and we hope to mail them the same day.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank Bill for being here tonight and for answering questions and for providing you with what I think was a very thorough presentation. So